A Shalom Akim, Shabbat Shalom, giving all praises, glory and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahweh Shai, Ba'ashem Makakwadash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders, great millstone, for teaching us the truth. And salutations to the sincere Akim and Akwathim and listen. May the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai, back in here with another quick and Lord's will is always an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I wanted to go through this idea of polygyny and how it's so important in terms of building a nation. And what really inspired this lesson, I overheard this these women speaking about. I think he's an Israelite from Jamaica, that had, I think he had about 22 wives basically, right? But I think he had about 23 children, right? And I'll say it like this, a lot of our women have been seduced by the philosophies of the serpent and essentially doing the bidding of the enemy, because they don't even understand the importance of their own seed being continued, because it's majority of our women that be deleting their own seeds, and sacrificing their seed onto Molech, right? So through these abortion clinics and so on and so forth, right? So I kind of wanted to go into this a little bit, because there's a misunderstanding in regards to, I find, polygyny, because it is seen as something as a mere sexual fantasy rather than seeing it as a tool to actually bring forth a nation, to actually building a nation, maintaining a nation, right? Because what's happening, within these times, you see why the Lord's ways are actually, let me start with that actually. We see in real time, we're getting like a snapshot of why the Lord's ways are strongly needed upon the planet Earth. And this is one of the reasons why this is needed, because look at the way, these societies actually govern. Here it is, you have a society that has a declining birth problem. And secondly, you have, people are unable to actually afford to be able to have children. They're essentially postponing it, right? Because they can't, they're being essentially, they're being overworked, right? So more and more time again, we're starting to see the importance of the Lord's ways are really truly higher than, the ways of this world, the ways of these people, the ways of Esau, because Esau is not, remember, Esau is a servant. Esau is not he's not somebody who is actually fit to rule. So this is Isaiah chapter 55 verse 8, and it says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, and neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord Yahweh. For as heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts your thoughts than your thoughts." I'm sorry, right? So you see that why these certain ordinances are needed upon the planet. You start to see, because what's these great nations, Canada, the US, and certain EU nations, they're suffering from a declining birth rates. So knowing that a man can have more than one wife would solve this problem. This would tremendously solve the problem, because then you actually have, the children are able to be brought forth, and not being able to actually continue in governing the nation, or the children, or you have servants, and the servants, they bring forth their children, and they are able to continue the duties that is allotted to them, right? But you're having a nation where now children are growing up. You have basically given the women, and you've uplifted the women, I should say. You've uplifted them, and having them think that they don't need men, and you've created a hookup culture where they actually think that they are men, so they're trying to perform the thinking and believing that they're men, and now it's essentially realizing that it's destroying them now, right? They're now faced with loneliness, and now they're being canceled out because they're not actually fit to actually perform the role of a wife anymore. They weren't groomed to be that way, right? They weren't groomed to actually perform the way and think that a man actually is able to do that. A man is actually being able to do that. We women cannot do those things, right? But this is all, you know, a bamboozling, of the serpent and his fruit and his philosophies, his ways, because these ways, actually bring forth death and destruction upon you women, right? So I wanted to, kind of discuss this a little bit, because it's seen in a negative light, because it's not seen as something that is actually brought forth to maintaining um a nation, right? So let me read this. Okay, this is Exodus chapter 1, verse 15, and it says, "And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of the one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, When ye do the office of a midwife of the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared the Most High, and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. And the king of Egypt called the midwives and said unto them, Why have ye done this thing, and saved the men children alive? And the Hebrew midwives said unto the Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian, for they are lively and delivered ere the midwives come in unto them. Right. So I'll read verse 20, and it says, And therefore the Most High dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very mighty. Right. And this is very important here because, during this time, it's a very interesting account, because how the Hebrew women essentially, they understood that the males are actually the ones that carry the seed. The man is the one that actually carries the seed to actually bring forth and continue alive, continue the children, continue the legacy. Because when you go into how would you call that? I think that field is called like physiology or human and like anatomy and stuff like that. The man carries both the X and the Y chromosome, so he actually possesses both, and women only carry the X. And now we're seeing, as time goes on, within this Babylon experience, this Babylonian experience, the Y chromosome is actually disappearing, right? Through other different factors, right? But the women actually understood that. They actually understood the importance of the male offspring. That's really what I kind of want to hit here, right? To actually bring forth more children, to bring forth essentially seed after his own kind. Because here it is, our women, they might lay and get with the enemy and all these other nations, but they don't understand that they don't bring forth, they are not the ones who bring forth seed after their kind. They're not in charge of that. So whoever they lay with, so for example, if they lay with a Japhite or an Edomite or a Hamite, man, they're bringing forth that lineage after that man's kind rather than after the Israelite man's kind, right? So this is also, showing the importance of the seed and showing the importance of, of culture, right? Showing the importance of, polygamy, right? So if a man has more than, if he has more than one wife, he's able to actually multiply his own seed, right, and actually bring forth a nation. But our people don't understand that, when it comes, because they've been in the West for so long, where they just think about, this what's it called? They think about this, monogamy, and really and truly monogamy, this is my opinion anyway. I think monogamy is just a way to actually control their multiplication, because the other nations, especially Esau, they're in fear when Jake multiplies, just like they were. As a matter of fact, let me read that here, because that's actually a growing sentiment of what's going on right now in America. Exodus 1. I'll start at verse 8, and it says, I'll start at verse 7. And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. And there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. Verse 9. And he said unto his people, behold, the people of the children of Israel are more mightier than we. Come on, and let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us, and so get them out of the land, right? So it's a threatening sight, just like how it's a threatening sight, within America to see, you see Jake, being essentially the majority, and that's another psychological operation. Jake is not, we're often told, especially for like the more darker hue tribes, they're often told that they're 13% of the population. Not Esau is carnal, right? So, Esau is afraid, that their nation is being overran by Jake, right? Being overrun by you Israelites, right? So you Israelites need to understand that you're actually the majority, you're not the minority, because this is the way we multiply. When we multiply, the heathens, especially Esau, is threatening, with taking their women and so on and so forth, right? I kind of just wanted to read that, as well, because that kind of speaks to, what's going on in America and deportations and so on and so forth. But going back to the topic, really, of the lesson, really, it's more about, continuing your own lineage and your own legacy, your own bloodline, right? Because these other nations understand that. It's just that our people don't have a rulership type of mindset. That's another aspect, of it. They rather do the bidding of the enemy, especially our women specifically. They rather do the bidding of the enemy by deleting their own children, sacrificing their own children, often their own children, right? So the enemy doesn't have to do essentially so much. If they poison your mind, then they can essentially infiltrate and control how many children you actually bring forth, right? So this is Psalms 127, verse 3, and it says, lo, children are an heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. As arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are children of the youth. Happy is the man that hath his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but when they shall speak with the enemies in the gate, right? So it's a blessing to have, a man to have lots of children, and that would actually be a strong benefit to a nation, right? But our people don't, especially our women, they don't see it like that. They kind of, they would rather see it, essentially they would rather see the Israelite man's testosterone controlled. When you're very when you're very wise, you're well spoken, you're in tune with Yahweh Bashim Yahushai. This is, they don't have a leg to stand on against you, because they really, in secret terms, they really envy you, but just to show really the importance of it, you're not. As a matter of fact, let me go to Jacob's story. Hold on. What's that? Genesis 30? Let me see. Just give me 1 second. Okay, I'll start at verse 32, and it says, and Leah conceived, um, and bare a son, and she called his name Reuben, for surely the Lord hath looked upon my affliction. Now therefore my husband will love me. And she conceived again, and bare a son, and said, because the Lord hath heard I was hated, she hath given me also this son, and she called his name Simeon. This is going to the birth of the 12 sons. And it says here, verse 34, and she conceived again, and bare a son. And now this time, now my husband will be joined unto me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore his name was called Levi. And she conceived again, and bare a son. And she said, and now I will please the Lord. And therefore she called his name Judah, and the left bearing. So I want to jump down across to verse 30. Chapter 30. And it says, verse 1, and it says, when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied the sister, and said unto Jacob, give me children, or unless I die. And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, am I in the Most High's stead, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of thy womb? And she said, behold, my maid Bilhah going unto her, and she shall bear upon my knees, and that I may also have children by her. So she gave the handmaid, to Jacob, right? Because the Lord shut up her womb, right? So, and it says here, and she gave him Bilhah, her handmaid, to wife, and Jacob went in unto her, and she conceived, and she bare Jacob a son. And Rachel said, the Most High hath judged me, and hath also heard my voice, and hath given me a son. Therefore she called his name Dan, right? So this is going essentially into the birth of the different sons, and I'm reading this also to show that, in the ancient times, a man would have more than one wife, and then the man would actually, or sometimes the women would actually have like a maid servant, or like a handmaid, or so on and so forth, right? Because there were certain situations where, she might have been, her womb might have been shut up, right? So, that handmaid was used, essentially to bring forth that man's seed, right? To, because they understood that, they weren't, their mindset wasn't like the mindset of women like today, where, they go up, they go to college, they become a medic, or they become a paramedic, and, they come, or a nurse, and then they sleep with all the different doctors, and so on and so forth. And then, they're struggling, working 80 hours a week, struggling to find a husband and stuff like that. They understood that part of their duty, was to actually, have children, care for the children, maintain a household, and thing, all those things that pertain to essentially home economics, caring for your husband, caring for the food that you eat, little things around the house that are actually very important to the household, right? They're not which those things are not as regarded anymore as they should have, knowing recipes, knowing, what types of teas to use, what types of, herbs to use for your body, and so on and so forth, because that's also a very, very important, because you play a very important role in the household and the caring for your children, because what they eat will also influence the type of milk that they might produce, to feed that child, right? So it's very, very, all this, the women in order essentially is very, very important to the household. They're very good helpmeets to the household. Not to forget other certain, household duties, such as like, okay, cooking, and, her knowing how to sew, her knowing different kinds of herbs, and so on and so forth, right? Those are very, very important skills. That makes a woman a lot more profitable to a man and his household in righteousness, right? Not, essentially hold out by Esau and being essentially taxed and taken out of the household, right, through what we have today, right? So, these things are very, very important to a man and his household, and she has certain skills, that complements a man and his household, right? But I just wanted to read this to show an example of like, okay, it's really about, okay, bringing forth, a nation, right? It's not because these people, and on top of that, I also want to do this lesson to also emphasize the point as well, because we live in a society that's strongly over sexualized, because and then people think of it, when people think of that polygyny, they think of it as merely as a sexual fantasy, right? And that's not what we're saying here. This is actually an ordinance that the Lord actually put forth, to actually essentially to be fruitful and multiply, right? To continue your seed and to actually prosper. The ways of the Lord are not grievous. This was actually meant to actually continue our bloodline, continue our nation. Even when you look at certain laws, for example, like Levirate marriages. So say, for example, in Deuteronomy, there is a law where if brothers, let's say if a brother has a wife and there is no children, no son or anything like that, and that brother dies, then the other brother would go in unto his wife and actually continue his name, right? It's all about continuing the bloodline, continuing the legacy, right? Our people don't have that rulership sort of mindset to actually continue forth their own bloodline, right? They have they're very short-sighted. That's a consequence. That's the mindset of our people, because they don't have the understanding of a ruler. They think like peasants, right? So these types of conversations are not meant for peasants, right? The scriptures say that the discourse of fools is irksome, right? So I just want to touch on that. Let me get this here. This is Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 6, verse 24, and it says, but the multitude of the wise is in the welfare of the world, and the wise king is upholding of the people. Receive therefore instruction through my words, and it shall do you good. Right? So this is actually, wise counsel that would actually affect the world. This is what would actually benefit, society as a whole. And this is the same thing that's going to actually occur in the kingdom of heaven, because you're going to have the scriptures say one shall become 1,000, right? So men are going to have they're going to have, multiple wives. Jake is going to have multiple wives, right? And each woman would have their own, they would have their own husbands, right? And then this is a problem in this society as well. You have a lot of women that actually don't have husbands because they've played harlots, and they've essentially been disqualified as a wife, right? So this is essentially wise and counsel on how to actually not just govern families, but to govern the earth as a whole, right? This is very, very, important. And disclaimer as well, I'm saying this as well, the scriptures do say also, not to be over righteous over much, right? So just because, a man can have multiple wives doesn't mean that in your zeal not to go out and seek that and destroy your situation. I'll say that as well, right? Because understand also the time we're living in, captivity, understand your own situation. You know what I'm saying? If you're having trouble like holding on a job or something like that, that's not something that is a priority, right? I'll say that as well, right? So because sometimes as young men, we feel the need to multiply a bunch of wives unto ourselves, and that can actually hinder you and destroy your situation, right? So I'll say that as well, for men who are also listening. But I I'll leave the lesson there. But Lord's will, this lesson was edifying. Just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to you. How about Shema Shai? Until next time, I say Shabbat Shalom.